Welcome to my channel. Here, I don't just speak, but I invite you to think. Throughout my videos, I've questioned the deepest held beliefs, from philosophy, the dynamics of religion and faith, to personal identity. I ventured into the controversial because I know that only in honest, critical confrontation do we grow. My voice is a search for truth, unafraid of what is difficult. If you join this community today, you don't just watch, but you engage. Together, we open the door to a courageous dialogue, one that transforms us. Subscribe, share, and let's keep questioning, growing, and seeking truth together. Well, hello, everybody. As many of you know, I've been talking about this show coming up for quite a while. I am very excited to be introducing today's guest to you. I'm a huge fan, Dr. Richard Carrier. So we're going to get into it here directly. But before I do, I want to just do a little housekeeping like I normally do. I want to, first of all, thank everyone who's been supporting this channel. It's continuing to grow. We did get over 200 subscribers pretty quickly. I think we're coming up on 18,000 views on the videos. And for only being at this for a handful of months, doing the one video a week, that's really tremendous growth. And that's because you guys are out there supporting the effort, watching the videos, commenting, sharing, doing all the stuff that you're doing. Ultimately, we are trying to work together to make the world a better place. We can only do that if we work together and we come together and share good ideas and correct information. That means we need to continue to push back on each other's ideas, expose what may not be working or what we should abandon, what's not ethical, what's not reasonable, what's not scientifically verifiable, what's not good for the planet, so on and so forth. So I really appreciate that you guys are supporting me in this effort. We are still promoting the Ark Encounter protest that is coming up in July. And so I've got a link included in the description of this video. There's a PayPal link there. 100% of those proceeds go to the event organizers. I will put your name in future videos after you've made a donation. Just let me know, hey, I made a donation. And I want to give you guys a shout out. They are putting together some kind of a little gift thing, something for people who've donated. I don't know all the details on that yet. But I've got the link to Joe's website there. And Joe from the Kentucky Atheist is the event organizer himself. So any details that you need, you can go directly to the source there. So I think that's pretty much everything I have. I'm going to go ahead and bring up our guest here. Okay, if I do this right. You guys know I don't really know how to manage all this equipment yet. I'm still learning, but please bear with me. Here he is, the one and only Dr. Carrier. I'm going to let Dr. Carrier introduce himself, and then we're going to just jump right into it. So good to have you here, sir.
Yeah, glad to be here. So yeah, Dr. Richard Carrier. My PhD is in, relevant to this episode, history of philosophy. So, you know, my main project is history, but I've got a big CV in philosophy as well. I published a lot of peer-reviewed work in philosophy, and I've actually been working in philosophy professionally for longer than I've been professionally a historian, or very nearly. So anyway, a lot of this led to a recent, well, last year or the year before, I've lost track now, of an article in Religions where I basically present decades in the making my grounding of morality theory. And that article, we'll mention that later, but it gets into, it has all the links and references to, like, it's basically the beginning, the gateway to everything we're going to discuss today, all the links to all the different articles, right? Cover all the rabbit holes that result in this. But for people who want to know about that, yeah, I'm Columbia University PhD from many aeons ago. And I run a website where I do very rare form of long form blogging. I do 4 blogs a month. And I'm entirely royalty and Patreon supported by people who hire me to do consults and things like that. So go check out my website at richardcarrier.info. If you want to know more, you can find all my books there, my social media, and so on. And that's how you can figure out how to follow me and see all the different other subjects I talk about. But this is one of the big ones that I've published a lot in, and I feel like I've made a lot of progress in terms of the philosophy. So we'll be talking about that.
Yeah, this is such an important conversation to have because as many people know, people who follow my community, I have a really diverse audience. We've got theists, all kinds of different theists, Christians, Catholics, Muslims, um, Hindus, Buddhists. We've also got atheists, agnostics. We've got deists, right? I mean, so I really have a very diverse audience, and I think that one thing that can bring us together is understanding morality, where morality comes from, what it means to be part of a cooperative social species, and how this all plays together. So I have been a believer in objective morality for quite a long time. I have not been able to successfully put together a syllogistic argument for it. I've tried so many times. I keep going back to the drawing board. You actually did such a wonderful job critiquing my last argument, showing me the holes in that. So I kind of got to go back and go over this again. And I think that I've been advised by several people to just abandon the syllogistic style argument and try to do it in essay form. And I think that may be what I have to do. But
it's a probabilistic argument. I mean, there is some deductive stuff to do, but that's the analytical side, right? Is what does it we even mean by morality, right? Like because that word, people can play games with what we're talking about with that word, and so you do have to figure out like what version, like what sense of morality are we trying to get at here, and that's deductive, that's analytical. You can get to that. There's the empirical side is like checking to see, is that what everybody on the planet is talking about, right? So there's an empirical side to that. But once you've nailed that down, it really is a combination of rationality and the facts of the world. And so, yeah, you do got to kind of do it in a sort of empirical way. Even the rational deductive component is not enough, certainly not enough to establish any conclusions in morality. It can only establish like what it is we're looking for, but to find it, that's still an empirical enterprise. So deductive syllogisms kind of get in the way, I think. Now I say that having done this in a peer-reviewed chapter way back in The End of Christianity, edited by John Loftus, I have packed in the back of my peer-reviewed study on morality there a whole bunch of syllogisms, so doing exactly this, but they're extremely elaborate. They're not easy to get through and would make a terrible video. And they don't answer the question that we really want to answer in the end, which is what actually is objective morality. Not once you figured out that it exists, then there's the more important question is, what is it? And the deductive syllogisms, all they do is establish that there's something to find, and that it can be found empirically. And that enrages enough people, right? That creates enough controversy just saying that before you even get to the question of which morals actually pop out at the end of that.
Well, I find it to be fascinating because I do see, having so many atheists and skeptics that I've interacted with over the years, and as people who follow my channel know, I'm a lifelong agnostic, so I don't have a deconversion story, which is a blessing to me. Excuse me. Where I feel fortunate because there's a lot of trauma that comes from leaving a cult, and that's what religions are. They're just a type of cult, really big, very successful cults, unfortunately, very well funded cults, but they are cults nonetheless. And so you get to, when you separate yourself from that, there is trauma that goes with that. So I don't have that burden. But
yeah, that's interesting that you frame it that way, because that's also true of me. A lot of people don't realize this, but I was never in any like hardcore Christian faith tradition. So I actually grew up in a very, very, very liberal, free thinking household. My mom was religious, but in a woo way, right? Very liberal woo Christian. And I was never required to believe anything. I went to Sunday school, but it was a very liberal Sunday school. It didn't like drill that you had to believe things or anything like that. It was all about just, we tell stories to teach you moral lessons kind of thing. And so I never really had that traumatic experience with Christianity. My experience with like hardcore right-wing Christianity that's actually trying to mess with people's lives and is actually creating problems for society, that came later when I became a voter. Then I started encountering that as a real problem, and it sort of woke me up to that. But at that time, I was a Taoist. I was a faithful, devout Taoist. So my deconversion story was less traumatic because I had a religion that I chose. There wasn't any sort of authorities telling me what I had to believe. It was all rationally arrived at belief. And my exit from the belief was therefore fairly easy because I just had to come to certain realizations that I had been wrong about certain things and so on. But what that left me with was not the trauma that you're talking about. What it left me with was, well, if that was so fulfilling and seemed so obviously true, if that's false, what is true? So I was actually as I left Taoism, I was highly motivated to figure out what was true, doing the same thing I'd done before, which is trying to figure it out through the evidence of the world myself, rather than listen to an authority tell me what the truth is. And so that's how I ending up as a secular humanist, and a naturalist and physicalist and all the things that I'm known for. So I didn't have that sort of anti-Christian reactionary thing. And you're right. I've met a lot of people who went and were treated terribly. The emotional abuse, they're lied to their whole lives. And so when they get out and start studying real sources of information, they realize that all the lies they've been told, and then there's all the corruption and misuse and sort of attempt to control, right? Towards values that ended up being toxic and bad for human happiness. And so, yeah, when you get up on the other side of that, you want to react to that, which is like, well, that's dangerous. We can't have that. And so there's a lot of justifiable antipathy towards that. And so I think but that can create a reaction that you say, well, then therefore I'm never going to attach myself to a worldview again, because clearly that's bad. But it's not the worldview that's bad, not having a worldview that's bad. It's the structure and the content of the worldview that are bad. And so this gets to the question of what actually counts as a religion in terms of what creates this folly that we're talking about, this sort of controlling, abusive, divorced from reality sort of understanding of things that does cause this trauma and cause people to justifiably react negatively to it. What is it about religions that does that? And it's really not the supernatural, and it's really not belief in God. Those are just incidentally, through historical circumstance, the component of most powerful money-grubbing religions that we have today, right? The religions that control legislatures and so on. Those just happen to be due to contingencies, happen to be God religions, and happen to be religion. Almost all of them religion of the book. Hinduism. You got Hindu nationalism, for example, is not a religion of the book, but it has a lot of similar features, right? Of the sort of oppressiveness, control, the dogma, being hostile to critical thinking, hostile to anyone who wouldn't agree with you, kind of stuff, in order to maintain this control and maintain the religion as the dominant belief of the society. And so, but when you realize that you can bring in religions like Hinduism and stuff, one of the things that I've made a point of in articles in the last 10 years is that it's not enough to get rid of religion. And if you just get rid of God belief or whatever, oh, I'm an atheist. Okay, I'm all sorted. I've gotten rid of the toxic worldview thing, and so I'm good to go. But really, that's not true, because you always land in some worldview, right? Whatever it is, you might not have articulated it, you might not have thought about it, but you've ended up with some beliefs about epistemology. How do you know what's true and what's false? Metaphysics, what exists and what doesn't. Ethics, about what's right and what's wrong. You've ended up in a worldview anyway. And a lot of that is kind of detritus of Christianity if you're in the West, or detritus of Hinduism if you're in West Asia, or the detritus of Islam if you're in an Islamic country. So escaping the religion, the dominant religion, is not enough. You really do need to then vet the worldview you land in. And if it's kind of a hodgepodge and it's not defensible, you need to figure out what worldview is correct. And the way to do that is not to go look for another authority to tell you which one is correct. The way to do that is to use critical thinking on your own to figure it out. What is most probable given everything that's available? And to do that, you have to be able to sort through the fog of all the disinformation and lies and propaganda that all the different ideologies push on you. And the thing is once you realize that's the thing you have to do, God beliefs are not the only religions you have to deal with. And so I know a lot of atheists who left religion and ended up in manosphere ideology, or ended up in some sort of fascism, white supremacism. There's a lot of atheists who end up in these sort of false worldviews, but those are just religions again. You're just jumping from one religion to another. And just because they don't include the supernatural does not make them not a religion. All the toxic things, all the bad things about religion attach to these atheistic ideologies as well. And so you have to like realize that you got to get out of this kind of like pre-manufactured ideology and figure out what is true, and it might not align with what any interested power is trying to argue that you should adopt, right? And so yeah, I've written the book Sense and Goodness Without God. That was my first published book, was my attempt at presenting a worldview and how one could come to it. And one of the points I make in the book is that you don't have to just believe me. What I want you to do is fact check all of this, right? Like, see, am I right? When I say this is more probable than that, am I right? Like, go check that, confirm it. Don't treat me like a guru. Use this as sort of a map or a guidebook to like figure out reality. And if I'm wrong, fix the thing I'm wrong about, and then you've got a better worldview, right? Like, that's my whole mantra about this. And I did an article a long time ago about Jordan Peterson, right? Going to like the sort of false worldview that he builds and sells, that becomes kind of like a religion. He's sort of like a pope of his own sort of loose, disorganized religion, essentially. And it has a sort of weird ideological component that is not explicitly supernatural. So that means it's a religion again. And so you can criticize it as a religion. Does it hold up? Does it fit the facts, etc.? Is it logical? Is it full of fallacies? You know, if there's good things in it, you can pull it out and still use those things, but you got to get rid of the bad stuff. And so this is the kind of process I think everyone as their religion should be doing this, figuring out, you know, being a philosopher, figuring out what is true without trying to buy a prepackaged religion, essentially a prepackaged ideology. Try to figure it out. And that means you got to really ask the question, how do I know who's telling the truth? How do I know what's true and what's false and so on? And so that's one whole side of philosophy, is that. And, you know, you might have to go through a lot to get to that point, because really you have to get through that before you can get to the question of what is morality. Because if you can't answer what is moral and what is not moral if you haven't figured out how to tell true from false, right? Like in just ordinary things. So anyway, that's kind of been my career, is building the blocks for this and like advice for this for people to do this on their own, and interacting with existing philosophy and so on. And so that's how I came to this point. And one of the main questions that I focus a lot of my effort on, because I don't see a lot of other philosophers focusing as much attention on this, which is what are we even talking about as morality, and how would we find out if it was true? And that's where I end up with articles like you'll find on my blog, where I have this open letter to moral philosophers, all your theories are the same, and where I go through all the different versions of moral systems that philosophers talk about. They're all talking about the same thing. And when you can figure out how all their ideas are true, what is the commonality that makes them all in part true, that's when you're going to get at the truth of the thing. And once you got to that point, now you can start doing productive work towards figuring out the difference between what really is moral and what isn't moral. And so that's the contribution that I've been working on. Have a lot of articles and studies on this for that. And I guess we'll get to specific questions in that domain.
That was really great. And there's a couple things you touched on there that I think are really important. When people are leaving, whether it's people who are leaving these religions or it's people who are growing up in a different type of a worldview that's still broken, when you try to free yourself from that, what you have to do is you have to face two things. There's the epistemic, the cognitive thing, right?
Yeah.
How do I learn to retrain my brain to make better decisions, to assess information more accurately, more critically? The other issue comes down to the morality, that, you know, how do I treat the world? How do I treat myself? How do I value myself? How do I value my life and give value to my life, right? How do I overcome nihilism, right?
Yeah.
Because that is a trap that people can fall into. They say, well, I built my whole worldview, my whole life is built around this particular worldview. Using religion as an example is really easy for us. Now I realize that there was no global flood. There was no Adam and Eve. There was no Exodus, and there probably was no guy who died on a cross. Where do I go from here? Because now that all my voting decisions, all of my social decisions, all of my personal value that I gave to myself was all built around this broken worldview. So you have to wrestle with that, and that's extremely intimidating for people. And I don't blame people for not dealing with that maybe in the most productive way, because that's a lot of work to have to do. And I'm very fortunate that I never had to go through that. And I have broken ideas and I need to recorrect myself all the time. It's not to say I'm some kind of like better than anybody else, but I at least don't have that baggage, that emotional baggage. I can draw value out of things, looking at the world around me more practically and realistically. And that gives me a huge advantage, you know? when you talked about, there's a couple things I see in skeptics and atheists is having come away from religion. They get triggered by certain words.
Yeah.
Morality, objective morality is one
Yeah.
of the triggering
Yeah.
words. The other one would be things like religion, the word religion itself. You did a great job of kind of showing us how, yeah, and this is starting to come out more in philosophy if you start paying attention to what modern philosophers are saying and stuff like that, and even in psychology. They're explaining to people, hey, religion is just basically a group think, right? Collective ideas. That's something that brings people together. It does not necessarily have to do anything with supernatural gods or anything of that, where we used to think of that specifically as religion. So
Yeah.
on the internet, when the Christians are calling the atheists your atheist religion or whatever, and the atheists are getting all pissed off, like, it's not a religion or whatever. I think we need to separate ourselves, step back from the situation, let them throw their stones in their own glass house if they want to do that, and then we could just say, what is my worldview? What is my religion? What have I attached myself to? Am I willing to look at that critically? And am I willing to defend that, from a
and then the question becomes like, how, right? So like this is the question I think that atheists get stymied a lot in debates, casual internet debates, and even sometimes formal debates, is that how do you defend your version of morality over ours, right? Like the usual go-to is to say, well, yours is based on this God guy. I can prove that God guy doesn't exist, so you don't have any basis for morality, which is true. But it doesn't answer the theist's worry, the sort of fear that keeps them trapped in religion, which is that without this made-up thing, there is no basis for morality. I can't defend moral views in any way. And that's not true, but it's just that atheists aren't trained in an alternative sort of empirical tradition for how to answer questions like what is good and what is bad. How are you setting those terms, and how can you argue that what you've defined as good and bad, that everyone would agree that that's good and that's bad and so on, so that they would want to align their behavior with it. This can be done. It's just not easy because it relates to extremely complicated realities, like how complicated reality is, how complicated human psychology is, the role of social systems and things like that. And so it's hard work to get there. But again, you mentioned the reactionary idea is to sort of be suspicious of someone like me coming along or you and saying that there is objective morality. What they hear when you say that is that I have a morality to sell you, right? Like I've got a political position that I want to sell you on. So it's more snake oil, right? They think there's more snake oil coming. But that's, of course, not what I'm trying to do. Like when I talk about religion should be philosophy, your religion should be philosophy, I'm talking about the opposite of what's wrong with religion, which is dogmatism, mythologization, and so on. I think true religion should be philosophical and therefore critical and therefore subject to revision over time, right? You learn something new, then you're going to change, right? And so like that's anathema to religion. You can't really advocate the idea that, well, we could be wrong about all this. New evidence might change it tomorrow. Like that freaks people out. But you have to acknowledge that that's true, right? Like you might learn something new, as people have done throughout hundreds of years. They've learned new things about how society should be organized, what is moral and what isn't. Like new ideas have evolved, and they have evolved empirically. I think that a lot of people don't think about how did we come to the decision that slavery is bad, right? It wasn't, we had got no help from the Bible because it literally just always sells slavery on us and never condemns it. Or the idea that women should have the vote, like that they have equal rights, like that idea. How did that come? You could talk about the historical contingencies that led to people believing that, but there were actual empirical reasons why those decisions were made and why they're correct, right? Then you can apply this to everything in morality. So yeah, there is stuff, there's work to do there. And in reality, of course, people, the way we've organized late stage capitalism now is people are overworked to the point that they don't have a lot of free time to actually stop and pause and think about the way that they're being manipulated by disinformation, the way that they're controlled by their culture and things like that. And therefore, and then have time to like work out, well, if that's all bogus, what is true? Rather than just throwing out everything, what do you build back up in its place? And that takes work and time and thought. And we're not teaching kids these skills in schools because we've organized our school system towards making factory workers and not towards making philosophers. And certainly there's a lot of stuff working against us. And especially now in the post-truth era, where we have massive amounts of disinformation and very skillfully coordinated mechanisms of propaganda that are designed to make false things look well argued, or to make false things, or even make true things look as if they're false, right? By using the same tactics that honest critical thinkers use to debunk bogus things, people defending bogus things will use the versions of the same tactics to try and deconstruct and get people to stop believing in true things so that they can sell them on the false thing. And this can be very tiresome and very exhausting and exasperating for people, and it can be difficult to get around. But in the midst of all of this, there are some of us who are trying to penetrate the fog and get at how we can answer questions like this. I'm convinced it can be done. But I'm not selling a simple solution to anything here. There's nothing easy or simple about any science. And I'm advocating the idea that morality is itself its own science, a prescriptive morality, not descriptive morality. Descriptive morality is a science already. It's part of anthropology. So cultural anthropology already studies the moralities that already exist, the moralities that people already practice. But prescriptive morality would be a science of determining what is the best morality for everybody to adopt. And I think there's a resistance to wanting to allow that to exist as a science because of the fear that it could be captured by the elites and used to sell a false morality, right? It's just another facade to sell a false morality. That's a legitimate fear, and it does require critical thinking to resist that. And so I think that's what you're getting at when you get to the point of people are reactionary once they've left. They've been conned, they've been gaslighted, they've seen this game before, and so they're suspicious of anything that looks like the same game. And I don't blame them, right? And so that requires the reaction of not throwing everything out. It requires the reaction of applying critical thinking until you can actually find something that survives review. And that's what we need to be doing when we're looking for objective morality.
And I think there's another thing to touch on here, and I want to be really clear about this, that I'm not intending to criticize unduly or to belittle anybody who is going through this. I'm very aware of this religious trauma syndrome. Yeah. It's called RTS. There's been books written about it. I highly recommend it. I'm supposed to have an author come on and talk about that. My schedule's filling up, but it is a really important thing for people to be able to understand, where do our fears come from? Because how do we face them and stuff like that? But what I do see a lot happening especially on the internet space, is when it comes to the morality question, is that particularly with the Abrahamic religions, they are beating over the head the atheist and saying, you can't have access to morality epistemically because you don't work it back to a higher power, to God or whatever. And so your morality is meaningless. It's based on man's laws or whatever. And we have objective morality because we get it from God. Well, that isn't objective morality. You're not making a case for objective morality. They just don't understand what objective morality is. But the atheist, the typical atheist, doesn't study philosophy. They don't know what objective morality means either. And they were raised saying these things to other atheists when they were believers. So they just think that God's morality is objective morality, and objective morality means you can own slaves if God says so. So I am going to have my subjective morality as a humanist, and I'm going to say, no, we don't want to own other people as property. That's demonstrably a bad idea, right? But I'm going to call it subjective morality because it can't be objective morality because I'm not basing it on God. And so there's this real misunderstanding of what happens here. And I think it's just all reactionary without being really fundamentally educated. Because what I find interesting, and I've had a handful of formal debates now. In fact, I have one coming up next month on biblical morality. And in my debates on morality, I have cited your work, actually. And I've had two debates on objective versus subjective morality, specifically not biblical involved, but just on the objective versus subjective. I cited your work both times, your peer-reviewed work in MDPI Religions Magazine from 2025, that article, and that peer-reviewed article. And I've also cited that I've looked into different studies, and like Pew Research, for example, 75% of modern philosophers are atheists or skeptics. Back in, I think it's 2009, over a little less than about 56% of these philosophers were moral realists. And all the way up now, 2020 is the last study I looked into, where it's over 67%. So philosophers who are themselves majority atheist, right, are also the majority moral realists. So the people who study this actually know the philosophy behind morality and objective morality. They think that morality is objective, the majority. But 99% of the atheists on the internet all think morality is subjective. So there's this disconnect and between the people who really study this field and the people who just are out there, living life, trying to do the best they can. And they just don't understand. And I think it's because they don't understand how you get to the subjective versus objective. And one of the pushbacks that I get all the time because I talk a lot about this on my channel, because I think it's important. Not only is it a fascinating philosophy to study, going all the way from, Plato, Aristotle, you can work your way through Hume, Kant. I mean, so many philosophers have talked about this into modern day yourself, Ayn Rand. I mean, there's, ethics and morality has been discussed by almost every major philosopher, and they've got their own models for it, because it is fascinating. But I think there's a utility to it. When I think of objective morality, what I'm ultimately grounding this in is in nature. Nature sets the rules we have to play by through the laws of physics. We evolved to be a social species. Cooperation is paramount to our success and to our thriving. And morality deals with this cooperation question. And morality, another thing people misunderstand is that morality is not the goal. Morality is the action. What ought I do? What ought I not do? The goal is subjective, right? I want to cooperate. Once you select this goal of cooperation, then you can find the objective truth that will lead to the success of the goal. To try and couch all this in a way that people understand, and I've not done a good job because I'm not a philosophy major. And so I'm trying the best I can to muddle through this. But I think it always comes to me back down to ontologically, every single human being, man, woman, child, gay, straight, trans, doesn't matter. We're all human beings, right? We all bleed red. We all need food on the plate. We need a coat on our back. That puts us at this even starting point. So morality should be able to build up from there. And if we all treated each other as equals, I tell people all the time, I don't have friends or enemies. I have brothers and sisters. Some brothers and sisters I really enjoy spending time with. Other brothers and sisters I wish I could disown, right? But I can't, because we're all one species. So if you can kind of put yourself in this mindset that even the person who I disagree with is the same as me at the end of the day, it's just our decisions, our choices are what separate us, right? So we could fix that. I can't fix their skin color, and I shouldn't want to. I can't fix their sexual orientation or whatever. Maybe these are not things that need to be fixed. These are things that need to be celebrated and appreciated, and working together with diversity. So this, to me, makes the world a beautiful place to be. And so I think there's a utility, a very important reason why we should look for the objective moral way to live, because it feeds into this cooperation.
Yeah, and trying to get that, like, where the the wheels hit the ground kind of thing. One of the examples that often gets mentioned is Rawls's veil of ignorance, which is John Rawls, the philosopher. He built this thought experiment for politics, for how would you organize society, but you could do it also for morality. Like, what morality would you want everyone to adopt if you don't get to choose who you end up in that society? So you don't get to choose whether you're going to be a quadriplegic. You don't get to choose whether you'll be poor. You don't get to choose whether you'll be a Muslim in Iran, right? You won't get to choose who you are. Or a man or a woman. If you don't get to choose who you are, you're going to be parachuted into a society, and you're going to end up in a position that you can't predict. What morality would you want everyone practicing around you? And you can argue that then that should be the morality you should adopt yourself. And then, really, in a sense, all moral theory is attempts to argue against that, right? So attempts to say, like, well, here's why I don't think I should do that. And then, the moral objectivist would come along and say, like, well, here's why you're wrong about your objection to doing that. And when you take these arguments all the way to the basement, as they are, when you get to the bottom of everything, you end up where I'm doing my work, which is where is the basement, and then how do you build on the basement? And so I think there's ways to get to that basement through straightforward arguing about how we should be. And I think Rawls's veil of ignorance is a really good idea to start these kinds of debates. And then it's where you end up when you're trying to argue whether you should obey that morality or not obey that morality. But you could at least get someone to agree on what that morality should be, right? Because you say, like, when you take Rawls's position, what morality would you anyone, like, you just say yourself, what morality would you want everyone else to adopt, regardless of where you were? And so everyone can agree on what that would be. And so then it's just arguing over whether you should follow that morality or not, right? And that gets you into all, and that you argue, well, why that? Okay, then why that? Then why that? You have the Aristotelian pathway where eventually you get to the bottom of what your objection really is and whether it holds up or not. And so really, like, all moral philosophy is technically engaging in that argument, even though it's not framed that way. And so I think that's an important thing to remember. And while you mentioned the Phil Papers survey, I actually quickly went on to Phil Papers survey, and it has the correlation between theists and moral realists. And I'll just mention here, let's see. So, that's the wrong one. So here we go. We got theism, philosophers who reject theism. So that's atheists. And of those philosophers who accept moral realism, out of something like 1,500, 729 are yes to moral realism, and only 456 are no to moral realism. So that means a significant majority. You can figure out what is 729 divided by 456, figure out what the percentage is, but you can figure out what the ratio is. That is, and that tells you, like atheist philosophers are hugely in favor of moral realism. Like, this is, there are more moral anti-realists among atheists than theists, obviously. But it is important to note that, atheist philosophers are large majority position moral realists. And that tells you something. That means that, like, the professionals who are spending their whole careers figuring this out have landed on moral realism, most of them, right? Even the atheists is the point. So I think that's a thing to look at for sure.
I think it is really interesting too, because when you look back, there's two areas that you can look at as just kind of just taking a broad view of the world that we actually live in. If you're able to look at things critically, and honestly, which is a skill that a lot of people, unfortunately, when they're in religions, don't have that skill. And that's, again, no shade on those people. But like we mentioned earlier, when you get raised into a dogmatic worldview, it retards your ability, reduces your ability to be able to actually think critically. So
and you will have been taught methods for getting at things that you'll keep. So when you leave the religion, you're still using apologetical methods of reasoning that you've not deconstructed all of it, right? Like, that's why there's a whole deconstruction movement, which is to, like, get that stuff out of you, because it's still stuck in there. You still are caught with these thought patterns that were drilled into you, and some of them you notice are bogus and you get rid of them really early. But some are buried really deep in there. You don't realize that they're misleading you, and they're leading you to false beliefs still, even after you've left religion. And so deconstruction is one way to get to the root of that and figure out your whole epistemology needs to be overhauled, right? You need a whole overhaul of that, because you were so gaslighted growing up that you were miseducated. You were not taught things you should have been taught, and you were taught things you shouldn't have been taught. And that has affected you. And so to get rid of it, to really slough off all of that skin, you do have to do this sort of deconstructing and get back to a defensible epistemology. And I think philosophy is really the only tool that we have for doing that.
Well, exactly right. And I think that not only that what you mentioned there, but in so many cases, and I see this in politics, identity politics a lot too. You're being encouraged or even instructed, depending on where you're at in your growth period and maturity and stuff like that, to reject things offhand, as opposed to investigating and then rejecting. You're literally told to just know if it's the opposite color of our color, it's bad. Just, that's just the way we do things. If God's not involved or the wrong God's involved, you just turn away and just, abandon it. And immediately you don't have to consider anything that they're saying or whatever. And that's a real problem. But when we are able to step back, I see two things that we can look at. One, we look at, if you study world religions, and even at a cursory level, you don't have to really get too deep into them, but you will find very quickly that there's this common thread that runs through all religions that I've studied. And I've studied a lot of them. I don't have degrees in theology, but I've spent 30 years studying these different topics. And one of the threads that I have noticed, it's known as reciprocity. We think of it as the golden rule. Yeah. And you see this all throughout religions, right? Which gives you an idea that you treat me like I want to be treated. I treat you like, I treat you like I want to be treated. This makes sense. And this is what these religions ultimately build all their morality ultimately gets built on, up to a certain point to when they have to do the us versus them thing. Well,
That's right.
we don't want to make the Israelites slaves. We can give them an indentured servitude contract, but the other people we can make actual chattel slaves. We don't do that to our own people. So you get the in-group, out-group at some point, and the whole shit just falls apart.
Yeah.
The other thing that you can see is it's called game theory. And what they found out in game theory is the most successful, or what people consider in test subjects consider to be the most successful way to win the game, so to speak, right, is called tit for tat. It's not I take all the coconuts for myself and I leave you out there high and dry. No, I actually share my coconuts with you. You share your fish with me, and I don't screw you until you try to screw me. You know what I mean? So it is very much like this golden rule concept. You know, you start out.
Yeah, I really do think that the reciprocity principle, which, absolutely, Christians will sell this as something Jesus invented.
Yeah,
but no, it was already in Judaism before that, and it was already in paganism. It was already in Confucianism on the other side of the world with no connection whatsoever. So like multiple cultures are independently arriving at this, and I do think this is kind of like sort of a proto game theory. There's a primitive understanding of game theory is this idea. Now, there's been advanced science on game theoretic principles, and the way game theory proves things is you can basically run a bunch of games, as you have different choices you can make in every scenario, and you could run thousands of sims, and you can see like what behavior over 1,000 sims, which behavior gets you the best results overall, right? So it's not it's more of a risk theory, right? It's not a situation that it always works out for you. The question is, which behavior works out the best for you the most often, right? So it makes it a little more complicated to see how it works. But when they've done this, they've done these sims to see which behaviors defeat other strategies better than others, and it's tit for tat with an asterisk, which is tit for tat with a small amount of forgiveness and a small amount of vindictiveness. And the reason is that tit for tat can go into a failure mode when you have no forgiveness. Then you end up in feuds, and that's when you get situations like the Middle East crisis that have been going on for hundreds of years, right? Thousands of years, you could even say, because no one's forgiving anybody, right? No one can move on, right? No one can actually take that step, and that's a failure mode. So that the tit for tat is it's stuck in a failure mode there. But if there was enough like a sort of procedure for reconciliation and forgiveness, so you could move on, you could reset the feudal tit for tat and start over, and then tit for tat will work for you and make things better, right? But you have to actually commit to this sort of forgiveness mode. But then, of course, bad actors will take advantage of the forgiveness mode, right? So you have to have a certain amount of vindictiveness, which is where you decide, okay, we've forgiven this person enough. They keep taking advantage of us, so we got to cut them off, right? So we're not going to forgive them anymore. And you do have to have this sort of complex system in place. And there's a question of like percentages of forgiveness and vindictiveness. And you can run the sims and show like what the percentages are best and so on for defeating all alternative strategies that can be thrown at you in terms of how to behave. And you can find like generally like the biblical religions are the worst at working out a good balance of forgiveness and vindictiveness. They usually have the wrong amounts and the misdirected in the wrong ways or so forth. But you can find some like more of the sort of secular philosophies that start in the ancient world and work their way all the way up to, Hume, Kant, now, Philippa Foot is one of leading influencers on me in the 20th century, for example, where they've got more sophisticated, where they understand this principle. Now, I want to point out that it's not all about game theory, because there is another side to this, and it's the psychological inner side. So game theory is about how your behavior brings shit back on you, right? Like, does it bring good things back on you or bad things back on you? Does it put you at higher risk or lower risk? It's basically an interaction with the outside world. But psychologists have found that there's a second operator, which is how do you feel about yourself? And the truth is that when you think in terms of like Rawls's veil of ignorance or something like, or reciprocity, you think like, if I was that person that I'm treating a certain way, I would hate me. Right? So if you realize that, like, and if you think of all the people whose behavior towards you makes you hate them versus makes you like them, when you realize you're becoming the person you hate or like, this actually affects your decision making in terms of what sort of person you want to be. And so it's not just about reciprocity, it's also about, can you live with yourself really, right? And so this is where we get a lot of psychology about how bad actors will lie to themselves and tell them that they are a good person despite all the objective evidence to the contrary, in order specifically to avoid this realization that they hate themselves, right? And when you have to lie to yourself like that, you basically end up stuck in a delusion where you have no accurate information about who you are as a person, and consequently you're not going to interact with the world very reliably at all. And you're also, your own self-satisfaction is going to be wildly askew, because you're going to end up being frustrated more often, you're going to end up being paranoid more often. There's a lot of downstream negative psychological effects for this sort of lying to yourself method of getting through life. Whereas if you're honest with yourself and then attune your behaviors to who you really want to be, it gets rid of all those downstream negative effects psychologically. So there's also an inner psychological reason to want to be moral. And there's a really good, it's interesting. We might get into natural law theory at some point. But there's a Catholic scholar, Catholic psychologist by the name of Bergman, and he wrote the best article about the science of basically moral development. And the idea is that it's children who need to be, who make moral decisions based on whether they'll get punished or not, right? So it's all about rewards and punishments, but that's a very childish behavior. When you get to like adolescence, you start to build a sense of who you are as a person, and you actually start making decisions about who to be based on how do you feel good about yourself being that sort of person? Is that the sort of person you even want to be? So that you're actually self-motivated. You don't need the external rewards and punishments to keep yourself in line. You are your own reward and punishment to keep yourself in line, because you can see and realize, like, this is how I'm behaving. This is the kind of damage I'm causing. This is how I'm affecting other people. Once you have that realization, then you actually want to regulate your behavior in a certain way. And when you understand both of these things and they actually have common alignment, well, that's the foundation of objective morality. There are actually objective truths about which things are better. Like I just mentioned, the simulation studies we could run with game theory, there is an objective fact as to what the best behaviors are. Like we can show this. And then in terms of like psychology, we have tons of evidence regarding the psychology as to what sort of person you will be happier being without having to lie to yourself. And so that's also an objective fact of the world that we can get at. So you can get to these things, and they do end up in a lot of places where religions tried to end up. Compassion, honesty, like some of these things that you can kind of superficially see make the world better or worse, depending on whether people are honest or kind or not. And that's how religion sort of absorbed these ideas. But there is a sophisticated analytical and scientific empirical way to pursue this, where you can take this to its natural conclusion is scientifically. Anyway, so that's how I get at moral theory and moral results. And for people who want to know like the nitty gritty, the analytical stuff, find the citations of the science and all that, I do that in that religions article, which is, let me see if I can find that one. Let me see if I can check that out. But you can go ahead and respond to that.
There's so much to unpack there. And
Yeah.
I really love the direction. No, I love the direction this is going in, because this is why this topic gets so complicated so quick. Like I have people that say, okay, objective ethics, if there's this moral realism out there, there's this objective moral truths out there, where do they exist? Like, are they just floating around the ether somewhere? And I get all these crazy questions that I think that just, it's like a complete missing the boat entirely of what we're even talking about, right? We have to bring it back down to the basic level of, like you just said, and you said it so well, put yourself in the other person's shoes, and not just a person that you identify with, but somebody that you actively reject. Put yourself in their shoes and then say, now, what do I think the moral facts should be for this life? Can I then think of myself in my position, and what would I like to have moral facts be? And can I draw a bridge? Once you can find the common ground between those two positions, then you can start to say, oh, wow, you know what? There is a kind of this moral truth out there that could apply to all people in a social contract. And we need to really understand that we are, I think it's easier and easier with technology and things like that to understand how small the world actually is. We are one species. This whole race is just a social construct. People they still get caught up in this race division stuff. We're Homo sapiens. That puts us, like I said before, ontologically, we at the root, we're all the same. And so if we could build bridges from there, it's really easy to understand what objective moral truths would be. I do cite, there's a couple things you mentioned here. So one of the things I look for to try and break it down to people to make it as simple as possible is to think of virtues. And I look at the golden mean, an Aristotelian virtue. And you can also find this in Buddhism. When you look at the Four Noble Truths that lead to the Eightfold Path, what you end up at is what's called the middle way. And this is very similar to what Aristotle was talking about, right?
You can see, and these are developed independently of each other.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So you see they're seeing a common reality to both human psychology and social reality. Like what happens when you're too compassionate? What happens when you're not compassionate enough? And so you can see like there is a certain amount of the golden mean, which is that ideal amount of compassion that is the right amount. And that's the kind of thing that tit for tat asterisk is doing, right? Is that there's just the right amount. Like there is too much and there is too little. And so you got to figure out what does that mean. And so, I think that's an example of something that we've empirically seen for a while and have tried in different ways to formulate Buddhism, Aristotelianism, and so on. But that means that there is a scientific objective reality there that we could refine and get at empirically. So that's an example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And for people who want to know, it's you can just Google objective moral facts exist in all possible universes, and my name, Richard Carrier, and then you'll find that article. It's open source, so it's not behind a paywall, and that has the basic analysis of the real basement of this argument, and then it has citations to articles I've written, to other philosophers, to scientific studies, and so on, that are the breadcrumbs to pursue this further, essentially.
That's an excellent source. And that's the one from MDPI Religions Magazine.
That's right. That's 2025. So that was last year. Yeah.
Yep. That's the one I've cited many times. And I think that when we say, okay, the virtues, and I try to be very, very clear with people, because I'm not talking about the virtue that you're going to get from the Catholic Church, for example, right? I'm talking about really, like I said, an Aristotelian type of virtue where we're looking for that golden mean, the perfect point between excess and deprivation, right? Too much or too little. When you look in the middle, you need to attain wisdom. That's paramount. Wisdom is considered the fundamental virtue, right? Because without wisdom, you can't really understand what this middle ground is. And a lot of people don't realize that there's a significant difference between wisdom and intelligence, right?
Yes.
Intelligence is simply taking in information, processing information. Wisdom is when you can apply that information correctly.
And there's a step in the middle, which is knowledge, right? So you can have someone who's very smart but very dumb because they don't know anything, or all the information they have is false or whatever, right? And then you can have someone who has a ton of knowledge, super erudite, studied a million things, and they can be super smart and solve all kinds of problems because they can figure things out really quickly. But if they haven't actually applied that knowledge to figure things out, like you point out, they don't get wisdom. So like even knowledge is not wisdom. Wisdom is understanding the significance of what you know. Knowledge is just knowing stuff. And intelligence is just how quickly you can learn things, basically. And so intelligence is the least relevant of all of those, essentially.
That's right. And the application step is really important because it actually involves the ego, because the ego tends to prevent us from applying things that we know, doing what I know I should do, because my ego is saying, let's be more selfish. The ego, having a balanced ego, is extremely important. You need to have.
Also, this gets to psychology and what we know scientifically about people. And Aristotle got this right. Like, this is the point. He says, like, you can't just rationally assent to some virtues, flip a switch, and bam, you're a virtuous person. He understood that you have to habituate the virtues because you have already been pre-programmed. Your pre-programming is messed up. And so to behave differently reliably, you have to readjust that programming. And that takes habituation. So he says you have to habituate the virtues. You have to practice you have to commit to wanting to acquire these virtues and therefore work at it over time. So that they become your habits. The virtues become your habits rather than your vices, as you know, you put it in those terms. And so that's what you're talking about there. It's the same thing. It's not always just selfishness so much as laziness or rolling in certain ruts that you've just built to roll in. It's not possible. It's not enough to just rationally understand something. That's not enough to just flip the switch and change out your behavior. You do have to commit to wanting to change, and change is a process. And so if you've been a bad person and you want to become a good person, there is work involved. And so a lot of people like that's where selfishness comes in, is not so much that they want to selfishly get the things they want. but they don't want to devote the time and effort to become a better person. But you can do that. You can be motivated to do that if you appreciate the benefits of doing it. Like you realize, yeah, okay, I can see how this has worked out for other people. I need to do this. And we see this in self-help stuff all the time, right? Like if you adopt this new diet or this new exercise or this new list of principles or whatever, your life will be better. And a lot of that is bullshit, or people can't, they've proven that they can't stick to these things. It shows that people are motivated to try, right? Because they think, I need some package that works. And Aristotle's point was the virtues are the package that works. So if you work hard at acquiring the virtues, you will be a more satisfied person. You will be happier with who you are as a person, and you will have better relationships, and you'll be better situated in society, and so on. And you will have better protection against the risks of caprice, right? Like of disasters and misfortunes and things. You'll have more resources to combat those, and you'll face less risks in terms of like ending up with a bad crowd, or ending up a drug addict, or ending up in jail, or ending up crushed under debt or whatever. So like Aristotle's idea is like the virtues are not a one-to-one, you get the thing at the end, right? It's you could still get screwed. It's just the virtues reduce the chance of getting screwed, right? So it's bettering your situation in terms of risk theory. And this is one of the things that's hard for people to understand, because you think like, well, if I'm good, people will take advantage of me. And it's like, that is true, and you should be aware of that and adjust your behavior accordingly. But in net, you're going to be, like, statistically, you're going to be better off being a kind and honest person, and sometimes get taken advantage of, and then respond to that accordingly, and so on. Whereas if you're just a dishonest, cruel person, you're going to be miserable a lot of your life, right? You're going to be paranoid. You're going to be dissatisfied. You're going to be an angry person. Your relationships aren't going to go so well. And you'll be constantly frustrated and dissatisfied with how things are turning out. You can't get to that wisdom of contentment. And that is a form of wisdom, is getting to that point where you can realize, why am I even bothering being alive, right? Like, what is it about being alive that is good? And there are aspects of life, just of living it, of just experiencing it, that people skip past because they're so busy doing whatever the hell else they think they need to do, like make money or whatever it is, that they miss the actual living of life. But the wisdom is realizing that the real happiness is living in the living, right? It's not in the making the money or whatever. And so that's how, like, there is a sort of reality here in terms of how virtues correlate with what we call personal success, not necessarily financial success or anything like that, but just success as a person, as a human being. That's what the virtues are, in terms of what is it you need to adhere to become a better human being, and thus minimize your risk of harm and maximize your risk or your benefits and so on, or your chances of benefits and so on. And so the fact that it's a risk theory, that it's not a guarantee that being moral will always work out best for you, but in the same reason, like being selfish doesn't always work out for you either, right? And so it's in terms of which one works out best in the long run, in terms of accumulated risks and accumulated effects. And the virtuous behavior wins that argument, but it's not easy to see why that is the case, or that it is the case, or why that matters that it is the case. And that's why that's the aspect of moral theory that is difficult for people, I think, to get at, because they're often going right at the superficial. Well, I mean, I could just steal money. Why don't I just steal money? Isn't that easy, right? And that's the kind of, like, to see why that's bad, why that you're actually, and I say bad in the sense, like, even for you, like you're taking on unnecessary risks. And in terms, not just externally, which you are, but also internally, like in terms of what sort of, where you get to that wisdom and contentment, you're running away from wisdom and contentment if you do that. And this was the insight that the Buddhists had, and the insight that Aristotle had. And we can scientifically perfect it now, because we have the empirical methods to really drill down on where all this pays out, essentially.
I think there's, and this ties into the next point too, because when I point at the virtues, getting people to understand, first of all, wisdom, as we talked about, what is wisdom and how does it apply, and why is it so fundamentally important to everything that we build up from there. Once we understand that step, then we look at things like, as what you mentioned, there's two things to touch on. One, so it's a journey, not a destination, right? So courage, for example, once you understand how to attain courage, that in between recklessness and fear lies courage. Once you can attain true courage, it gives you the tools to better face all of your problems. It doesn't mean your problems go away. it just means that now you have this tool in
Yeah.
your toolbox that you can apply, and it makes your
That's
life
right.
so much better.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it is this constant journey. You constantly have to self-reflect and make the adjustments as you go through life, because you're going to have different experiences that challenge you. It challenge your courage and challenge your integrity and so on and so forth. And so as you go through these things, it's like I said, it's a continuous process. I think that Nietzsche, people misunderstand him so much because they focus on the nihilism and they say, oh, there's no
Yeah.
purpose in life, there's no benefit. No. That's the first step. When you leave religion, that's you abandon yourself from this unreasonable and just factually untrue objective standard, objective
Right.
basis for goals and stuff. And then you say, now I can give a value to life. What is the value of life? Oh, it's in the experience itself. And I think the Stoics did a great job in this, really pointing this out, and why fight against nature? Why fight against, embrace fate to a certain degree, free yourself from all these expectations. And again, expectation ties right into Buddhism on the other side of the
And
world.
Taoism. Yeah.
Absolutely. And Taoism as well.
One of the basic principles that really bettered my life, like it had a big impact on my life when I was a faithful Taoist, and I've kept it ever since, was the basic teaching, which is, this is a Taoist teaching, is that expectation is the source of all disappointment. Mm-hmm. And so if you can reduce your expectations, you'll be disappointed less. And that's kind of a key to being happy a lot more, right? Like you're more contented with your life, you're happier with your life, and you're freer to find the joys in life if you're not constantly disappointed. And one way to be disappointed less is to just have less expectations. Don't have so many expectations. Now, one of the things that I realized, one of the many things that led me to leave Taoism, is that you can't live a life with no expectations, right? Mm-hmm. This idea that it's like the Buddhist idea, eliminate all desires and everything will be fine. It's like, that's actually an unachievable objective, nor even a desirable objective. You should have expectations and desires 100%. And in fact, you can't enjoy life without those things. But it is a valid point that you want to minimize them to the things that really matter and jettison the ones that don't matter. And so if you get burdened with the ones that don't matter, that's when life gets worse for you, both internally and externally. So you'd mentioned like courage in terms of as a tool to face things, but also you feel better as a person the more you can realize courage in yourself, because you would rather not be a fearful person or a reckless person. You would rather be the wise, courageous person. And so becoming that actually is a source of happiness and joy and satisfaction with yourself. So that is inherently, so you've got both the internal advantage and the external reciprocal advantage. And these are objective facts. Like this is a reality. And one of the things I point out in my article is that this would be an objective fact in all possible universes, no matter how you changed anything, physics, anything, whatever you change, you would always end up with these same observations, because the psychology of a conscious agent, a rational conscious agent, is always going to be, in this respect, the same. No matter how much you change anything else about that psychology, the brain, or anything like that, these core things are always going to be the same by virtue of being rational and by virtue of being conscious. And then there's always going to be interactions with people. Game theory is going to be the same in all possible universes. The circumstances will change, but the rules of how to navigate those circumstances won't change, because there's a certain inherent, objectively unavoidable dynamic between interactions with other people or interactions with an environment. So even if you change everything, there are still core principles that are going to be true across all universes. And this means that you can't get rid of morality. There's no way you could redesign the world to get rid of it. And that's also why we don't need God. God doesn't really ground any of this. And you had brought up God earlier about how they use this as the model of objective reality. And I wrote an article for the philosophical journal Philo many years ago. I have a blog article, I talk about it. And the basic idea is that theists build this thing in a box of God, arrow, morality, right? And I said, look, objective morality. But the thing is they have no access to God. We can't phone God and ask him what's moral, right? So they've actually taken this box and they've completely disconnected it from reality, and they fill the middle with subjective shit they make up, right? So it's like what does God want? What does God not want? Well, that's what I feel God wants. Damn it, that's freaking subjectivism. You don't have an objective morality. You have a subjective morality. So this by creating this fake appearance of objective reality and selling it that way, it's a false flag. They're essentially creating sort of the satanic facade for what's actually behind that is really just subjective morality, which is also just opinion that can be swayed quite easily by any mythology or dogma or peer pressure or whatever. So it's not a reliable morality. It's not an objective morality. So getting it objectified, getting it actually down to actual objective facts that are true, regardless of what your opinions are, regardless of what your beliefs are, that can only be done by appeal to the nature of a rational agent inherently, which is going to be true qua rational agent. So all rational agents in all universes are going to be the same in terms of being rational. What defines them as being rational? And then reaction to the environment, right? So there's going to be a certain set of ways your behavior interacts with the environment and interacts with other people. These things all turn out to be the same, even when they change based on circumstance. And so when you understand that, you see that, like I was just recently reading the article in the Stanford Encyclopedia Online, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, on natural law theory, because I wanted to brush up on like how do natural law theorists actually ground things? And in truth, I realized like the actual arguments of natural law theorists are really ultimately the same thing I'm arguing. It's just that they force fit God in there for no reason. Mm-hmm. So like their idea is that God arranged nature in such a way that you can learn morality from nature. You don't have to talk to God. He arranged the world in such a way that if you behave a certain way, things will work out for you. That's kind of the natural law. Or will work out. Let's put it that way. They don't necessarily say work out for you, but it'll work out. It'll be the best outcome, let's say. And that's kind of what I'm arguing. But their position is that, well, if God hadn't arranged the world that way, then the world would be arranged capriciously. And so the natural law wouldn't exist. But the thing is their own logic entails that it would exist. It just would be different than they think, right? There would still be a best way to interact with people. There would still be a best way to be rational. There would still be a best way to interact with the environment. So the entire basis of morality and natural law theory would support the existence of objective natural law, as they would describe it, in every possible universe, including all worlds without gods in them. And so natural law theory is kind of self-refuting in the end. Like you can't get to God through natural law theory. It's just a recapitulation of this. And I point this out in the article on religions, where like theists are stuck in the same place we are, and ultimately they end up doing the same things we are doing to get to the same result, which is what they think objective morality is. And the only thing that's different really is that they stuff a bunch of mythology in place of scientific facts to get the morals they want, rather than actively, like, sincerely wanting to figure out what the morals are, right? Like they're not asking the question of what really is moral. They've pre-decided what's moral and then are trying to figure out a way to defend that with facts. They don't have the facts, so they invent a bunch of myths and stories about how the world works, about how gay people are and all of this stuff that are contrary to reality. Like they're not scientific empirical facts. So in reality, in practice, natural law theory ends up being dumb, but it has the right idea. And then if you just get rid of all the supernatural God stuff, you can actually use it to get to the correct understanding of how empirically would you discover moral truth. And so there's a truth in there that I find rather interesting when I was looking at that. And that kind of gets to what you're pointing out earlier.
Well, I see threads of what I think of like what I would define as Pauline Christianity. Personally, that's how I would kind of couch that version of Christianity. You know, it's completely removed from the Gospels and it's completely removed from even Second Temple Judaism. It's really its own thing, and it just became this monster. Thanks to Rome and all that. But you've got this idea that the law is written on our hearts. And then we see it like in Aquinas, who's leaning heavily on Aristotle to come up with natural law. And so we see how they're trying. They recognize that there seems to be this way that as a cooperative species, we function in nature. And as people who are really self-motivated, as you touched on, and this is a really important part, the self-motivation is ultimately what we get at. Even when we're a cooperative species, altruism as a principle is not functional at all. We cannot be altruistic as a principle. Nobody would survive, right? Long enough to help anybody else out. We got to be.
That's again. You're getting to the Aristotelian mean, right? That's too much altruism is bad. Too little altruism is bad. Where is the mean? Where is the ideal mean? And that's an empirical question that can be answered scientifically.
Well, I think that it comes down to the benefit of all this really is to the individual to flourish within the group. And as the individuals flourish in the proper way, living in a group community, then the entire community flourishes as well. And we see this in like really any group concept that we look at. Like sports is a great example. It's so easy and so many people are into their sports, right? I used to do a ton with sports, very athletic myself. And each individual member in a team sport, obviously, has a role to play. And when they play their role well, the team does well. And it requires this sacrifice from each person. You know, the guy on first base can't run across the field and try and catch the ball at third base because he's not going to get there in time and he's going to leave the base open. And so he's got to stay in his position. He's got to do the right thing for the right reason, you know, even if that means not doing anything at sometimes and just trusting his third baseman to make the play, so to speak.
And also there's the dimension that the game isn't fun if you're not following the rules, right? So right. Like what it's just become stupid and no one would care if it was just a free for all. Like what's the point of this? And that's kind of like a sort of toy example of how, like, if reality just became that way, it was just a free for all, an anarchic chaos like Road Warrior. That would suck. Everybody would agree that would suck, right? Like, and it would suck way more seriously than if a baseball teams just started beating each other up to run the ball around or whatever. Right? Like they just disregard the rules, right? Like, what's the point of watching this game?
Right, like the pigeon on the chessboard kind of thing.
Yeah, right. No, you were talking about self-motivation, and I think that is an important one to, like, the game theory aspect. That's what we just ended with there. That's an example of game theoretic aspect of this, is the external consequence effect. The reciprocal effect is just, you got to manage that. And so this is kind of what Kant was getting at when he said, he tried to come up with a moral system whereby it's similar to Rawls, where it's the idea that, like, you should behave in a way that if your behavior were universalized as a rule, you would agree that that's how everybody should behave, right? Essentially, he phrases it more technically than that, but it's the same basic idea that you can't expect people to be honest and kind if you're not honest and kind, right? So there's this kind of reciprocal expectation. And I wrote an article about the movies that influenced me. It's on my blog. And one of the movies I talk about is Blade Runner. And I don't know how many who are watching this know the story of the original movie Blade Runner, but the gist, this is a spoiler, sorry, but the gist is that the antagonist, this sort of villain of the story, who's basically killing a bunch of people to try and extend his life because he had his lifespan artificially limited and he was just going to drop dead at some point. He's trying to fix that so he didn't have to die. And he's going after all the people who made him that way and who are in the way of him getting to those people. And there's this cop who's hired to go kill him to stop him, right? And it ends up in the end where their roles are reversed and the cop is about to fall to his death. And so he's basically, oh, and by the way, the cop has killed the woman he loved. He's killed his friends. Like, it's like he has every reason to let this guy just fall to his death, right? And no, the villain of the story, quote unquote, the antagonist, as we formally say, watches him gleefully as he's about to fall, but then saves his life and puts him down and explains to him as his last dying words, because his clock is stopped. He's about to die. His last dying words, he explained, why did I freaking fucking save you, right? And he gives this story that it kind of captures everything that we're talking about. He gives a story of why was life so special. And so it has this whole idea of, like, his experiences and his memories and all the things that were wonderful. And, like, he's not explicit about the motivation, but it's very clear that if you pay attention to the movie's plot and his decision making up to that point, is that he realized that if he's willing to go through all of that to fight for more life, if he thought life was that valuable and he thought society should have given him more life, that he would be a hypocrite if he behaved differently, if he acted exactly like the society that screwed him over and let that cop die. No, he rescues the cop, but basically to realize his values and show that his values are better than the society that screwed him over. He says, I saved your life because I think lives are worth saving. And you guys should know that, but you guys aren't living that way. But this, I'm showing you, essentially. But he doesn't say those words, but if you understand the story and his final speech and his movement, that's where you understand, like, that's the kind of moral message. And that really captures the reality of morality, of the self-motivation aspect. And this has been studied psychologically, and a lot of it comes out of child development. And it started with Piaget, like there's kind of the early child development theories, but there's been developments of his moral development theory since then. There's a lot of science on this. I cite some of it in my article. And the idea is that this idea that you should be good or bad based on whether you're punished or rewarded whether someone pays you to be good or beats you if you're bad or whatever, that is literally childish. That is the attitude of a child. And what demarcates childhood from adulthood, which makes the difference between immature and mature, is the realization that you are your own motivator, that you make your own decisions about what sort of person you want to be. And so you don't need to be punished or paid to be a good person. You want to be a good person because that is who you want to be. And that's the mark of a mature person. So when you run into people who still have the childlike mindset, those are people who really haven't grown up. They're really not adults yet. They could get through that stage and become mature. But I think this idea of like becoming an adult really means this idea of coming to the realization that you are your own moral motivator. You are your own conscience in terms of, you are your own God in terms of your monitor and what kind of values you want to realize. I mean, you're not God in terms of being omnipotent or omniscient, but you are the moral authority. And that puts responsibility. You would realize when you realize this, it puts moral responsibilities on you. And you do have to think in terms of the downstream consequences of everything you do. What would the society be like if everybody behaved like this? What kind of values do I really want to instantiate in the brief time that I have here? Like, what kind of thing do I want to represent? And when you think of it that way, you do get these objective morals. And like you said, they do trend in the liberal direction. Like they said, I think the line is that reality bends in the liberal direction, right? Is the idea. And that is true. Like, liberals are on the sort of cutting edge of moral truth in the way that conservatives are resisting moral progress. And that's just been kind of the story of humanity for the last 200 years at least, and certainly beyond.
Well, that touches on something that's actually very important to me, and something I haven't done a lot of work on it on my channel yet, but I intend to make some videos on it and really get into this, because one of the things that I see, we need reform in a lot of ways in society, politics, and everything else. And one of the key areas where I see a big problem, and this is globally really, is how we handle the justice system, and what are we doing with criminals, and what are we focusing on? Are we focusing on rehabilitation, or are we just putting people on timeouts? And that's not really, there's no motivation.
We're doing worse. Yeah, we're worse.
Yeah,
than that,
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree 100%. And so we obviously have to separate criminals from society. Otherwise, there'd be people out there killing people with chainsaws or whatever they're doing, crazy shit they're doing. But we got to separate them. But we need to rehabilitate them through education, or assess, is this personally cognitively unable to understand? Because reasoning is a key part of this. If there are people who are born with antisocial personality disorders and so on and so forth, bipolar disorders and stuff, where they literally mentally cannot get it. They don't understand anything we're talking about right now. They're void of these types of emotions or empathy. They just don't have empathy. So obviously that type of person, you can't reason into changing their behavior. We need to be able to identify who can be reasoned with, who not, and really put the effort into each person as an individual. Just as you had said at the beginning of this whole thing, which is very important. What if you were that person? How would you want to be treated in that
That's
situation,
right. Mm-hmm.
while still keeping the goal of protecting society in mind? But you mentioned something in here that's really important. It does kind of tie into something else I wanted to touch on that you had got inspired in me, because I still tying this all into these virtues and stuff. One of the virtues, and mentioning this right now, justice comes from the word justification. It's not just about criminal justice, but it's about how do you epistemically justify your actions or your claims and things of that nature. And justification, true justice, the necessary precondition for that is fairness, which means treating like cases alike. And I had a conversation with a gentleman the other day, a Muslim gentleman, who was asking me, is the West lost and dying? And we had a great conversation. I posted it on my channel. And one of the things I was explaining to him is that this fairness concept, you got two guys, they both jump over the same fence, right? One guy jumps over the fence because he sees a kid that's in the pool drowning and he wants to save the kid. The other guy jumps over the fence because he wants to break in the house, kick the dog, and steal the television, right? And so those are not like cases. And people say, well, they both jumped over the same fence. It's like, exactly. And that's where your broken epistemology is, because that's where you're stopping. You're picking an incorrect demarcation point to say this is the same thing. They both, and you got to really be willing to get into the weeds and see what makes this situation different. Oh, one guy's saving an innocent child. The other guy's stealing somebody's shit. So that's how we start to, once you can understand what like cases alike actually means, then you can start to justify your treatment of other people, and so on and so forth. And this is, it all works together. And again, like it takes that fundamental building block of wisdom to be even be able to comprehend what I'm even saying with all of this stuff.
Yeah,
right?
and there's totally the game theory aspect of that, and the psychological aspect of that. And the game theory point of it is that the less fair a society is, the more fucked up it gets, and so it actually ends up like it's a more expensive, less efficient, cruddier society, right? So like that affects everybody. Everybody has to live in the society where there's runaway crime, right? Like so the rich people can try to hide behind walls and guards and all of that stuff, but the fact they have to spend so much money hiding behind walls and guards and stuff like is a failure, right? That's an example of this is a failing society. That if you have to do that, your society is broken and is inefficient compared to a society where you wouldn't have to do that, right? And so there's a game theory aspect of it, but also there's a psychology aspect of it. There's a lot of psychology showing that people tend to be better, they behave better, and are happier, like feel more content and satisfied with their society, the more fair the society they're in. So if they perceive their society as it will always treat them fairly, no matter what they do, that has a positive psychological effect downstream, and that makes everything in the society better. And so, yeah, that is totally true. There's many aspects of fairness, and that's one. You gave one example of that in terms of commensurate response, but also in terms of like who's actually doing the harm. How is the balance of the reciprocity, the paying back of the harm? How is that being shared? And an unfair society like the West is very unfair in many ways. So, for instance, the rich are not treated the same for the same crimes. Even when you have commensurability, like you're talking about, the rich basically don't suffer the same thing. So there's this perception that they can get away with anything. And the Epstein files is like a paradigmatic example of how we failed as a society, where we've basically proven that we will never prosecute criminals of a certain social class, right? Like they're just never, we won't even investigate them. And that shows a fundamental lack of fairness that is going to wreck society throughout, like all the way down to the farmer in rural Montana, right? Like they're all going to be affected by this. Even if it's not directly, it's going to have its cascade effects down throughout the whole society in terms of costs, in terms of like social stagnation and decay, and stress and unhappiness and everything. It's just a foolish thing to think that this is a good system to have, and much less to defend it and actually support it, right? Like, so it's why we have the most corrupt Congress I think we've ever had in the history of the United States, because they literally don't understand this principle that they are literally nuking our entire justice system and our society. And that really is what makes everyone feel desperate. That makes everyone feel like, well, I'm not even living in a fair society, so why should I be fair? You're not being fair to the rest of us, right? So yeah, so there's downstream consequences to all of this, and you can show this empirically. Like you can do political science studies, economic studies, and so on, and show this objectively is the case. So yeah, you always have objective, factual arguments for moral conclusions and political conclusions and justice conclusions and all of that. It's not subjective. It's not arbitrary. And even when it's relative in a way that's logically true for everybody. So it's still realist, right? So yeah, all the usual complaints where the theists will say, well, if you abandon religion, you're in subjective relativism or whatever. And it's like, well, you're not. No, there's tons of factual reality in terms of how you should behave. And it does tie back to what motivates you to behave. And that is true. And so anyway, that's one of the things that I've been very big on trying to emphasize. And I think other philosophers sometimes don't emphasize this enough, I think.
Well, I think something that you have alluded to multiple times throughout this without specifically articulating it, because it's just been like kind of the given or the assumption that just follows naturally with what you're saying.
Yeah.
First of all, this has been brilliant. Just being able to listen to and discuss this with you, it's been absolutely amazing. And I do want to kind of try to wind this down to, because I said I'd be respectful of your time, and I would be remiss if I let the world's most infamous mythicist go without asking at least one question about historicity. So I do have one. I have one couched for you here from my own perspective. But I do want to just highlight this because this is really, I think, if somebody can watch this and take one thing away from this, because we talked about how it's complex and takes a lot of work to actually figure all this objective morality out. We're trying to kind of dummy it down to some basic principles. I think we did a good job of that. But I think the fundamental thing that people can take away from this conversation is that I believe it's undeniable that everybody, every living organism, not just people, wants to live a good life, right? The problem is, what does it mean to live a good life? And this is where I see the disconnect from, and I come from a really rough background. I come from the streets. I was incarcerated myself, and I'm one of the fortunate people that did turn my life around. And it does take what you mentioned earlier. That's really important. I want to highlight that is the first thing you have to do is you have to fix your mindset. Then you have to do the hard part, which is to put in the work. It's not enough just to correct your thinking. You actually then have to put in the work. And if you do, then you will succeed. I'm a perfect example of that. But it's what got me into that place that situation in the first place, right? Was having a broken ideology of what is a good life, right? People chase drugs and alcohol. They chase sex. They chase money, fame and fortune, whatever, power. They chase all these things that are an illusion. They're like a mirage, right? We think like this is the water, the life-saving water that I need when I'm out in the desert. And when you get there, you find out it's just a bunch of sand. It's just heat waves coming up, whatever. There's nothing really vacuous, right? Yeah. And this good life that we want, ultimately, I believe is attained. And what we're alluding to here comes from self-respect. And that's what I think we're really honing in on here, is that you cannot truly have self-respect if you don't understand what courage is, if you don't understand what fairness is, what justice really looks like, that golden mean or that middle way. For my religious friends out there, I always tell my religious friends, if you've got to be religious, check out something like Buddhism or Taoism or something like that. Get away from these Abrahamic faiths that are promoting all this bigotry and all this other insanity, that you get from this stuff. But either way, whether you want to do it from philosophy or religion, find this middle path here. And this will show you how to attain your ultimate goal of getting self-respect. Because when you do things the right way for the right reason at the right time, you can do exactly what you've been talking about, and you've spoken so eloquently about it today, is you can feel good about yourself. Hey, I can actually feel good about myself. I feel when I go rob a bank, right? I ultimately don't receive that same inner satisfaction. It might be a temporary fix because I got money and now I can go buy whatever I want, but I don't have that inner satisfaction because I know that I don't deserve the money that I got. When you go out and you work hard for what you've earned and you earn money that you worked hard for, you go home and your body is tired, but you have self-respect and you feel so good about yourself. You're re-energized from the inside out, and it motivates you to continue to work hard and continue to do the right thing. So I think that's really what people can, if they want to figure out this, what is this objective morality and how do I find it? Start there. Start putting your mindset in this. What would it take to truly have actual self-respect? Not this illusion that I'm chasing all this bullshit that doesn't really at the end of the day mean anything. They say you can't take your money to heaven or whatever. This stuff is so temporary and so fleeting. If you have this true self-respect, that's why people, I'm agnostic. I give the whole God thing, not the anthropomorphized God. I'm a hard atheist when it comes to that stuff because I studied the history behind it. I just know it's all bullshit. But when you look at like the gods in philosophy, like Aristotle's unmoved mover, I'm agnostic about that kind of stuff. I give it a 50-50. When I think about things like reincarnation, 50-50, sure, why not? The reason I don't worry about it is because I truly believe that if you have self-respect, if you're trying to live this good life, following this reciprocity, living by this golden rule, the whole God concept will take care of itself when I die. I don't got nothing to worry about, and it's not because I'm trying to be arrogant about it. It's just because I think that what's the point in suffering this through this life if you don't have this, what you really want, which is to make it a good life. And without the self-respect, you can't live the good life. So I'll let you respond to that. And then let me ask you one question.
The historicity thing will be so unrelated, but
I know.
No, you're absolutely right. And as you were talking about that, I was thinking, and I've been thinking about this a lot. Like I've been thinking about moral philosophy through art. There's been a lot of that, like a lot of really good television shows that explore these things. Andor is a good example. You could do a whole show on the morality and politics, the messaging of Andor, and how it creates a good mythology. And by good mythology, I mean a mythology that accurately represents the reality and how we should react to it in terms of our behaviors and things like that. And through good examples and bad examples is the point. But I was also just thinking of Reacher, and I don't know how many people who are watching your show have seen Reacher, the television show. And I'm not talking about the novel so much as the show, which Richardson is the actor who plays the lead character. And and there's a lot. I write a lot of articles about the manosphere and the kind of the weird mythology that they build to base all of their false beliefs on, that lead to completely incorrect ideas about what constitutes self-respect and what constitutes the virtues and so on. And so people who want to look into that, they can see I have a whole entry under my categories. Men's issues is in there, and you can check that out. But I'm thinking about Reacher, where like the idea, like he fits a lot of the sort of the manosphere's ideal of masculinity, because he's big and strong and handsome and all of that stuff. He's the alpha guy, whatever. But the thing is that, and they'll have like, what are the sort of the traditional ideals of masculinity? One of which is protects others, right? Now, in truth, that's also an ideal of femininity, because you have the mama bear protects others, etc. So there really isn't a gender difference. But anyway, they have this mythology, this idea that the idea of a man is a guy who protects the innocent, or whatever they're supposed to think anyway. But the thing is that Reacher doesn't protect the innocent because it's cool or manly. He protects the innocent because he actually literally cares about them, right? Like, he's actually understands their perspective and what they're going through and cares about them. And one of the illustrations of this is like his cohort, like one of his best friends that he goes on missions with and stuff, is Neely. And Neely, for various reasons, has an issue about being touched. And Reacher is entirely 100% respectful of her boundary issue in terms of that. Like, he might hug other people and touch other people, but he follows what she expects. And it's clear there's many scenes throughout the 3 seasons that have aired so far where he remarks on this. Is the idea is like how he respects her and her reasons. Like, he understands her psychology and where she's coming from, and he adjusts his behavior based on that understanding. And that illustrates this idea of, and that ties into, made clear in many different scenes, ties into his self-respect. Like, why he why he won't tolerate certain things is based on like his own image of himself and what it means for him to like himself. And part of that is respecting the boundaries of others and protecting them and all of the sort of things that he does. This sort of fit that narrative of like, why is he a noble person? Given the weird circumstances that the shows invent, but it ties into this idea of self-respect being fundamental. And when you understand that, it does tie into compassion and understanding for other people. Seeing things from other people's point of view is what it means to be an adult man today, right? Just as it is this to be an adult woman is exactly the same thing. And so a lot of these ideologies that try to push a certain idea of masculinity or whatever, or femininity even, oftentimes they're very shallow, and they forget this aspect of it, of how does that connect to the rest of the world, and how does that actually pay attention to other people, and how does that affect you in terms of how you realize yourself and your ideal of who you should be. And that ties into, like you were saying, like the satisfaction of doing work well and getting rewarded for it, versus doing something stupid and shady that even you would hate if someone did it to you, right? Like, right. That really ties in to that whole thing. And then same with respect to women. I read an article recently about how, and this was a scientific study, and it was done in Muslim countries, and they created a psychological testing scenario where they asked Muslim men to pretend that they were women in their own society, and then to explain to them, like, would they like that or not like that, and why. And they start like honestly admitting like how shitty it is to be a woman in their society and how they wouldn't feel so great about that. And or even like saying things like, well, I'm glad I'm a man because women have it like terribly. And I was like, but why do they have it terribly? Right. Right. Like, this is a thing you can do something about. Right. And so this getting people to like think about the consequences of their actions in the world upon other people and things like that is a part of self-respect and how you generate it. And so that ties into everything we've said the whole show.
I don't want to go down this crazy rabbit hole, but you just inspired me I do think it's worth mentioning because it does show there's another link here to when we talked about community and how this all works together. It's all kind of networked together. And that is, there was a TV show back, and I'm really dating myself here, but I think it was in the early 80s, maybe even the 70s, but it was called Stingray. And it's this guy, he's a private investigator, and the shtick was he drove like a 65 Stingray Corvette, which was a sweet car. But the whole thing about the show is that instead of taking money for his services, he took favors. He say, you owe me a favor.
Yeah.
And the really neat aspect about that show is that the way he solves these crime, so to speak, is he's just cashing in favors from other people.
Right.
So it's this whole network of favors. Now you owe me a favor, and then I'm going to use a favor from this guy to help to solve your crime. It's just such a great premise.
Right.
And I think that we have seen this in art, like you said. That's a really, really good example.
Yeah.
Okay, let me turn just completely to do a left-hand turn here, because like I said, to have you on my show and not be able to ask you this question. So I don't really get into the historicity, quote unquote, of Jesus. I'm much more concerned about what do people do with these beliefs rather than, and I do find the origins of these beliefs to be quite fascinating from a historical, perspective. I love to look at the different influences of where we get, Second Temple Judaism gets hit really hard by Zoroastrianism in the Persian period. Then we get Stoicism coming down. We get Eastern mythology with the Silk Roads, and boom, here comes Christianity. So I love to see how this kind of evolve, but there's but I don't really make arguments for any of this stuff, because to me I'm not qualified, for one thing, and two, I think there's more important things for me to focus my energies on. But I have made an observation, and I've made a comment about it here, and I've gotten actually a lot of pushback from my atheist friends in my community, and I want to present this observation to you and see what you would say to me. So I see that coming from critical scholarship, they basically say, look, we're going to accept three or four basic premises, right? That there was a guy who was born in Judea, that he had a ministry, that he was crucified, and that people believed he raised from the dead. We're just going to start there historically, right? Well, I'm looking at those 4 points, and I'm like, okay, I'll grant you the first two. It's irrelevant. There's probably a lot of guys born in Judea who were named Jesus, for one thing. You know what I mean? There could have been a ton of Jesuses running around. But where I find an issue with is the crucifixion narrative. When I remember reading, and I should have touched up on my reading before this, but I was so busy, I just didn't have time. But if I recall right, it was Philo who wrote about Pilate. I think Josephus makes a mention of Pilate, and
more than a mention, but yeah.
And if I recall correctly, Pilate is described to be extremely tyrannical, extremely stubborn, and extremely vicious. But when we read the gospel narratives, you don't get that Pilate at all. You get this weak, kind of wobbly, who capitulates to the Jews. Oh, you just tell me who you want me to release, and I just want to wash my hands of this whole thing. That's completely ahistorical. The other issue is I see a trope with the scapegoat tradition from Judaism, where you've got the one goat takes the sins of the world, the other goat runs free. And then when you get into the gospel narrative of the crucifixion, you've got two Jesuses, right? Yeah. Jesus Barabbas and then Jesus of Nazareth.
That's right, yeah.
Takes on this, and I'm just putting all these pieces together. And then the final piece of the puzzle for me is that from what I understand, the Jews had the authority due to religious freedoms within Rome to do it, to regulate their own justice system to a certain degree, and that at least according to the gospel narrative, the New Testament, stoning a blasphemer would have been permitted by the Romans for the Jews to carry this out, if we're going to believe the stoning of Stephen, for example, right? Or the later addition of the story where Jesus is with the
woman in adultery.
Right, yeah. Adulterous woman, right? The stoning. So we see this whole stoning thing. We see Jesus goes to trial with the Sadducees, right? And he's in the Jewish trial, and then they convict him of blasphemy with false witnesses and everything, and then they decide to take him to Pilate to deal with it. Why didn't they just stone him?
Yeah, right.
To me, the whole crucifixion thing, I don't think holds water.
Yeah.
Now, am I off base here?
A lot of levels here. Well, first of all mainstream scholars agree that the gospel Jesus is fictional, right? He's a fictional character. And really, like, you could talk about the influence of Jesus on the world. You're really talking about the influence of the fictional character of Jesus, not the real guy, right? Like, scholars will generally agree we know almost nothing about what the real guy really taught or what really happened or any of that stuff. And this ties into the morality thing. I have an article on, hey, dear Christian, you might be worshiping the Antichrist, where I point out that if you think of Christ as a character, as sort of an ideal. Oh, I got to sneeze. Sorry. We have pollen. We live in a forest, so there's pollen killing me right now. If you have the ideal of Christ, he doesn't have to be a real guy. There doesn't have to be a living Jesus in heaven or anything. there is still the spirit of Christ is the moral ideal that you embody. Like, right? Are you living the ideal of Christ? Are you embodying Christ? So when you worship Christ, it's like, are you making yourself Christ-like, right? Like, so this is not even an alien way of thinking of it. Like Christians often talk about, like, are you embodying the spirit of Christ in your behavior, right? And if you look at, and it's important to note that the word antichrist means opposite of Christ. This is important, right? So if you look at how conservative Christians, who are the dominant Christians in the United States, and are the most annoying Christians everywhere else, point by point by point by point by point, and there's a lot of points, they're doing the opposite of what the character of Christ represented and embodied and taught. So they're actually embodying the Antichrist. So actually most Christians are worshiping the Antichrist. And this is true even if there is no Jesus, like if there's no God, if there's no supernatural in it, it is still true in terms of the fiction, in terms of the ideals here. They are actually anti-Christians, not Christians. And you can see my argument. There's no way around it. Like Christians are cornered on this one. They're kind of screwed. They are worshiping the Antichrist. They've been deceived by the devil, whether the actual devil or the figurative one. So that you can tie that concept in as well. But to get to your question about Pilate,
the crucifixion, because the other thing I was thinking is there was no tradition where Pilate's going to offer up one criminal and let another one go. That's insane.
20 things at least that are ahistorical about the narrative in the Gospels. The Jewish trial alone breaks numerous Jewish laws in terms of how those trials are supposed to go. So there's all kinds of things wrong with it. The timeline, the when it's all happening, everything, the procedures, it's all wrong. It doesn't make any sense. So all of that is fiction, and it's very clear that it's fiction designed to sell a particular narrative, right? It's a myth to say things about the Jewish elite. It's a myth to say things about Rome. They're not true things. They're just things that they believe about those entities that they want the readers to also believe and come away with. And then the part of the issue of like Jesus is the innocent guy, but he's treated like the scapegoat, and Barabbas is the actual scapegoat, but he is the one who's released. So he actually ends up the correct scapegoat, and Jesus is the one who's sacrificed, who actually ends up the correct goat who's sacrificed to atone for sins. So there's this deliberate meshing of irony between which one of them, Barabbas or Jesus, is the sacrificial goat, or the scapegoat. And then, so it's clearly a fiction. It has a point of view. It has a message. That point of view or message may or may not be ridiculous. It doesn't matter. But that wouldn't relate to the question of historicity. And the reason is that we all agree, like I agree, mainstream scholars all agree that isn't what happened, right? Jesus, it's almost certain that Jesus got crucified, they say, because our earliest sources, which predate that, which we've got Paul, for example, keep saying that he was. Now, the problem is that the language for crucifixion actually is identical to the language for Jewish execution. So when we're reading Paul, we actually do, because Paul never says it's the Romans who do it. And he does at one point imply in Galatians that the Jews did it. And there's an interpolation in 1 Thessalonians that if you take as authentic, explicitly says the Jews did it. So there's no Romans doing it in Paul. And so it actually could be that Jesus was stoned to death and hung on a plank, crucified, as Jewish law required. So it's entirely possible. And we have a version of Christianity that was teaching exactly that just across the border outside Rome, where the Roman Empire wasn't relevant because the Roman Empire wasn't there. So you couldn't blame the Romans for stuff. So they were teaching a version where Jesus was executed by the Sanhedrin 100 years earlier. And so there was really a Jewish sect in outside the Roman Empire that was teaching this at some point. So they were able to create their own story in their own way in construction. So it's entirely possible that there's a hint of truth in that he was stoned and hung, just as Jewish law required. And it wasn't a Roman crucifixion. That could be the invention of Mark. But mainstream scholars don't really pay attention to any of this evidence, and therefore they just go with, well, the word usually means crucifixion, so we're going to assume that means Romans. So therefore, at least that part is true. But they wouldn't say that the depiction of Pilate is accurate. They wouldn't say the depiction of the trial is accurate. They say, no, that's all made up. we don't really know why he was executed. We have some speculations, we have theories as to why or what actually happened and so on. But that's the mainstream view, and it's an entirely plausible view. Like, I don't say that that's a ridiculous position to take. I think like the balance of evidence suggests that this is all made up, that there wasn't a guy at all. But I think the evidence is so undecisive that I don't think we can go around arguing that Christianity is false because of this. I think you can make a much better argument just assuming historicity and showing that the resurrection is impossible, that didn't happen, right? There's no evidence, no reason to believe that happened. And so you can refute Christianity without rejecting historicity. I think you have to get out of Christianity where you're no longer like faith stuck in needing Jesus to be real. And only then can you start to contemplate the possibility that Jesus didn't exist. And I think I've written about this recently, about the way people are reacting to this. I think the reason atheists have a problem with mythicism, the idea that Jesus didn't exist, is that they see mostly what they see as amateur mythicism, which is often spreading false information, bad logic, and so forth. This is terrible and easily refuted, easily strawmanned position. And they see that as getting in the way of their attempting to debunk Christianity, essentially, right? You're making atheism look ridiculous by proposing that Jesus didn't exist. And that argument makes sense when you're talking about the amateur mythicists that do really terrible, advanced, stupid theories and conspiracy theories and nonsense. But I think most of those people aren't looking at the serious stuff, or even when they do, they still want it to go away for this reason, that it's a weak argument against Christianity. They sort of mistake me as arguing that Christianity is false because Jesus didn't exist, when I have explicitly argued the opposite. But I said you cannot argue that Christianity was false because Jesus didn't exist, because it's too wishy-washy. The data is too weak, right? Like this is a weak T argument. And so anyway, I think that there's the knee-jerk reaction against mythicism is based on this sort of misunderstanding of what, even first of all, the difference between amateur and professional mythicism, and also like what is the actual objective and what is the actual arguments for that, and also like a sort of misunderstanding of why secular scholars in biblical studies are still stuck believing that apologetical methods of getting at conclusions are true. And this gets back to the point I made at the top of our show, where once people leave Christianity, they often don't realize that their toolkit for how to debunk things was invented by Christians to debunk true things, right? So it wasn't really a critical thinking tool. It was a set of tools for avoiding critical thinking, right? But it looks like a critical thinking kit. And so when they come out and are seculars, they're still using the bogus kit that they gave them. And that leads to false conclusions. And I see a lot of secular scholars, many, if not all of whom, certainly, or many or not all, if not most of whom, were actually educated in Christian institutions, right? So they came up in seminaries, often highly conservative colleges and stuff like that, and then became secular. But they were trained to be Christian apologists. And so now what they do when they're doing secular stuff, they're still using Christian apologetics. They just don't realize that it's Christian apologetics, right? You're still using bad methods to argue for conclusions. And this leads to a lot of false beliefs. So there's a lot of bad consensus theories in the field. And they go way beyond just the historicity issue. You can talk about many other aspects of the origins of Christianity and like the document theory and all of this. There's a lot of things that are mainstream consensus theories that are just bollocks. They're just based on bad reasoning that came from Christians, but because it didn't have the word Christian slapped on it, it's just assumed that it's valid. And there's a lot of resistance to admitting about this. That would create a lot of strife between seculars and Christians amongst their field, right? Their colleagues would get angry. So I feel like there's this sort of like tension and sort of people are getting stuck thinking about things the wrong way. And that's creating the attitudes that you're coming up with. But again, since this doesn't really matter to anything that you're doing, whether you could just go along saying it's plausible Jesus existed, but that doesn't help me with objective morality or anything like that, right? Like, so right. It's not really a useful thing. So exactly. I don't think you even need to get into the weeds of whether Jesus existed or not, because it is a plausible theory. That the mainstream sort of minimalist theory is totally plausible. It doesn't help Christians at all. And so, I think that's an acceptable way to go with that, rather than riling up atheists by
no, it's just kind of offhand
pushing mythicism. Yeah,
I got a lot of Yeah, I got a lot of hate from it. People are like, what do you mean there was no crucifixion? Even Bart Ehrman and everybody says he was crucified. I'm like, well, I'm not the scholar, but
Okay. But I would say in reaction to your theory that even I would say that the Gospels are not history, and most mainstream scholars would say that that's not history. So you can't argue from them being the stories being completely unbelievable that he wasn't crucified. Like, it's still totally plausible that there was some circumstance that got him killed. I even advance a plausible theory as to that. I think he was, if he did exist, he deliberately got himself crucified. That was part of what he thought would trigger the apocalypse. And I show that there's a lot of other of these guys who seem to have been doing the same thing, and would also have been recognized as Jesus Christ, because they were all doing Joshua-like things, and they're all doing Messianic-like things, and they were all doing things that got themselves killed. And I think they were all trying to initiate the clock in Daniel 9, where Daniel 9 says a Messiah will die, and then 3.5 years later, everybody will be resurrected and enemies will be crushed and whatever. So I think these guys are like suicide cults, essentially. I think Jesus is that kind of thing. So I think there's plausible historical narratives for historical Jesus that can be argued, and that would fit in with what you're talking about. Like, yeah, obviously the Pontius Pilate that you read in the Gospels is 100% fiction. It's totally whitewashed apologetic.
That's what I thought. Well, I do want to wrap this up now, just so for the people watching. I always do what do I call it? An open panel to give people an opportunity to come back and kind of, talk about anything they want to kind of create this community. So it's kind of an open topic if they want to talk to me about the subject. I'm going to let Richard Carrier go, but before I do, so I think the way I should do this is, I'm going to have Dr. Carrier give a final statement, talk about anything he wants, and summarize anything, or make sure to promote whatever he wants. I've got all his links to purchase his books. Use the link through his blog is probably, I'm guessing, the best way to do that. I've got that in the description. And then I will go ahead and maybe make a closing remark myself. Then what I'll do is I'll shut this stream down and then just immediately start another one up just for open conversation in case anybody does want to do the open panel. If nobody joins that and wants to talk about anything, then I'll just shut that down and I'll get on with some house chores here. But to try and be consistent, because I do try to make this an open panel every Sunday. So let's go ahead and have Dr. Carrier. Why don't you take a minute, have a final word if you have anything else you want to add to this, or promote anything that's coming out. I know you got a new book you're working on that should be coming out.
Well, I mean, there's the one that just came out, which is The Obsolete Paradigm of a Historical Jesus, which is a great place to start if you want to get in on this question. If you've not heard of the sort of serious peer-reviewed scholarship arguing this position, Obsolete Paradigm is the best book to start with, because it's the most up-to-date, and it starts all the threads. The breadcrumb starts there, and you can deep dive from there. So yeah, that's the book that's out. You can find that. And absolutely, buying through links on my website is better, because I get not just the royalty, but also a commission on the sale if you're willing to go through the Amazon link. And so I also that's my 10th book. I've got so many other books. So you can go to my website, richardcarrier.info, and see all the books I've done in a variety of subjects, not just this. And also, like I said, my social media links, my long form blog is there, which I do a lot of interesting, different stuff on my blog. But also I have classes. So I do online correspondence classes where you can, basically they're like old fashioned forums where you can ask me all the questions you want for like 30 days on a subject. And I've got like reading lists and challenge questions and things for each week on a variety of subjects. So you can go click on classes link if you want to check those out. So that's probably the easiest, cheapest way to, if you want to ask me a bunch of questions, to do that, is to join a class that relates to whatever you want to ask about and go from there. And so, yeah, that's my only thing in terms of, like I said, with morality, we've already, like paper I mentioned earlier is the one, objective moral facts exist in all possible universes. That's the breadcrumb beginner, the open, the gateway to all of that is the place to start for that. And then, yeah, I've got a moral theory tag on my blog as well. So you go down the category list, the drop-down menu, and find everything I've written on that, which is a lot of stuff. But I also write on epistemology and like just a million other things. So definitely explore that. Like if you want to know more of stuff that I do and things like that, go there.
I realized I muted myself there. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Carrier. I really appreciate your time. I'm going to give a closing statement, and then I'm going to shut this stream down. I see people in the chat. I do apologize. Normally I interact with the chat during the videos, but I was really wanted to focus on the guest because this kind of information really applies to what I've been talking mostly about on this channel, which is objective morality. Because as I mentioned before, I'll go ahead and do that. And thank you so much for your time. I will be in contact with you because I think I'd like to do another future project with you. And I appreciate you making yourself available to me. Thank you so much. So I do want to just highlight also, Dr. Carrier did mention some of the coursework that he does and stuff. He did make himself available. I hired him to critique one of my arguments for objective morality, and I'll be honest with you, I got way more than I ever expected to for the money I spent. It was extremely reasonably priced. In fact, I feel almost guilty, like I maybe should give him a tip or something like that, because he did such a fantastic job of really breaking down all my syllogisms, which I knew were broken, but he really explained not just that, okay, this point A, point B is broken, but he said, this is broken, this is why it's broken, and this is what you need to do to fix it or abandon it. It was so comprehensive, and I was really impressed, and I was so grateful for him to do that. That's going to give me a lot to chew on to be able to build a stronger argument moving forward. So I highly recommend, if you've got something that you are trying to work through in philosophy or in ancient history or any of the things the subject that Dr. Carrier studies, which he's pretty diverse. So I would highly recommend reaching out to him through his blog. And I also, like I said, I got the link to his books. Go through that link that's through his blog. He's also been very generous with his information. A lot of it, in fact, I would say the significant majority of it is not hidden behind any kind of paywall. For example, I've used Dr. Carrier's research in, he mentioned Daniel. I've had debates on the historicity and the problems with Daniel. And I don't want to get into that whole rabbit hole on this, but I've really leaned heavily on Dr. Carrier's work in my debate against Daniel. There's so much to that with, Nabonidus and Darius, and we could get into that whole thing sometime. Maybe I'll do a video on that because I don't think I have a video on that. But Daniel, one of my favorite books of the Bible because it's got some great stories, right? You got the fiery furnace with the three guys, of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You've got Daniel in the lion's den, and there's just some really cool stuff in that book. So I think it's like a lot of things in the Bible. Take it for what it is. It's great literature. There's some wonderful poetry, some great wisdom literature, so on and so forth. But abandon the supernatural stuff. Free your mind from this stuff because it is a trap. And we talked a lot about that in this video today. I do want to just wrap up by saying that whether you think that morality is objective or subjective, it's a great thought experiment. And I do think there's a utility to understanding objective morality, which Dr. Carrier and I touched on today. It will give you the keys to living it, not just a better life, the life that you want by attaining self-respect, but it will make you a more functional member of a society, of a community. I do believe that to be true. However, epistemically, however you get there really doesn't matter. What matters is that you understand equality. And I think that a lot of skeptics in particular say, well, morality is subjective, but I know that slavery is wrong, or I know that bigotry is wrong because I believe I'm a humanist. Well, that ultimately gets you to an objective grounding. Once you break down what does it mean to be a human being and to care about a human being and to live in a structure with social animals, even if you don't see it that way, as long as you understand that you are a human being and the guy next to you or the lady next to you or whatever it might be that's sitting next to you or across the table from you is also a human being, and you have the same basic needs, the same basic desires, and should therefore have the same basic rights. If you can get yourself to that point, you can build up from there and you'll be doing just fine. We can work together. We can improve the status of the world right now by starting to accept each other in the same way we want them to accept us. Dr. Carrier and I talked today a lot about what came down to reciprocity and how we see this common thread, not only in all religions, but we see this in philosophy. We see this in social situations. We see this when in psychology, when we start to do things like break down things like game theory and stuff like that. So we can get to this understanding in so many different ways. And there is a utility to it for you as the individual, because if you're a member of a community that's thriving, you're benefiting from that, right? And the globe is one community. Something else I want to touch on here that we didn't get into today, but taking care of the planet actually factors into all this because you need the planet because that's where we all live, right? So start to be environmentally responsible, start to be socially responsible. Think before you vote, please, next time. And let's do what we can to make the world a better place. And I'll go ahead and start up another stream after this. If anybody's interested in doing a live panel, I'll leave it open for maybe 5 or 10 minutes. I'll get a cup of coffee, and if nobody joins, I'll shut it down. But thank you so much, everybody, for coming by today. It was a great turnout, and thank you for your comments.
channel. 3.33 repeating, of course. That's better than I've done before. And Deconverted, what do you do? Just wait, objective ethics will be on your plate.